And so love is at the center of Passover. And now that we've been redeemed from Passover and bondage and matzah, we can continue with another week to study in greater detail some of the ways that love and sexual ethics are expressed in Judaism. So with that in mind, what I want to begin with first is the idea that in Judaism, all of the natural urges that any of us might feel are at best created by God within us. And if we use them appropriately, then they continue to be blessings and we derive some reward or pleasure from them. But let's take a simple example first. We have an urge to sleep. So God willing, we sleep when we need to. We sleep through the night and get up in the morning at a decent hour. And if we're productive and we appreciate what the gift and the blessing of sleep and the urge is, we don't overdo it. We also get up and we have an urge to work and be productive. So we also accommodate that urge within us. We're productive, we go to work or accomplish something meaningful during the day. Sometimes we aim for a work-life balance to be sure that those gifts and blessings are understood and appreciated by us. We have an urge for sexuality, to be intimate, to be physical, to feel that expression of love that God creates in us. Today we say love is love. In the 60s, we said love the one you're with. I'm okay, you're okay, all of those different things. But what it really was trying to do was to identify what was it, at least within Judaism, that we've been created to do and to be. Many things, and at least for the topic of tonight, we were created to love and to feel affection and romance. So if it's created by God, then it is by definition and by creation good. Because even in the book of Genesis in chapter 1, God creates so many things, and after all the creations, it says tov or tov ma'od. It's good or very good. So there isn't anything that God creates without a purpose. The rabbis even debated, and not to go off on a tangent, but what's the purpose of a mosquito, a gnat, a tsetse fly? Well, it may be beyond our complete comprehension, but it too was created by God. And if God created this urge for love within us, then it is good unless we exploit it or corrupt it. So in effect, all of us raised in America or in different places in a modern contemporary time, when we walked out of our houses in the morning, for all intents and purposes, the sexual ethic that we heard and learned about was not a Jewish sexual ethic. It was something else. Maybe it was Christian, maybe it was secular, maybe it was something other. But very often the lesson that we heard was, and I'll repeat it for you if you didn't hear it enough, don't talk about it, don't look at it, don't touch it, and God forbid, don't do it. And don't enjoy it. That was the sexual ethic. And of course, any natural young person, boy or girl or otherwise, wanted everything they were told not to touch, to enjoy, or to do, right? Because we were all teenagers. So Judaism comes around and really transforms and upends that sexual ethic and says, wait a minute, I don't have to avoid it as long as I understand what to do with what God has given me. We have an urge to eat, don't we? We don't fast except one particular day of the year. And even then, if you're not healthy or strong enough to do it, we're told eat. And in Judaism, in moderation, everything should be enjoyed. We dance, we eat, we drink, everything. Nothing should be avoided, but not to excess and not to our own harm. So sex is the same thing. Now, these sexual ethics and the boundaries that were placed around such a powerful and urgent urge that God created in us was created not to place a boundary around adults and their thinking, but around emerging teenagers, emerging young people. And so a person who was 12 or 13 with the hormones raging and coming of age and their bodies transforming needed some boundaries to be placed around them. And what emerged at the age of 12 and 13? Bar and bat mitzvah. Now, in olden days, certainly not bat mitzvah, at least not ritually or formally, but bar mitzvah for sure. Why was bar mitzvah created at the age of 13? Not because 13 is a lucky Jewish number. It's because 13 is precisely the time when young Jewish boys are changing. Their bodies are changing, their thoughts are changing, their interests are changing. And at least in the olden days, a young man and a young woman were married by the age of 14, 15, or 16. If they weren't married by 21, it was a shanda. I mean, if they weren't married by 28 or 29, a total disgrace. So at that time in their life as teenagers, my gosh, these were boys who were running amok, no different than teenagers today. So at age 13, they made them responsible for the mitzvahs. And in Hebrew, we call it the ol mitzvah. It means the yoke of the commandments. Now, none of us are farmers, and I think I've used this example or this metaphor before, and it works. Because what the rabbis were thinking of was that they needed to strap these young men with mitzvahs so that they would properly behave. And if you think of a yoke that you put on the back of an ox, if you don't yoke the ox in the field, the ox will meander through the field. It may sow the seeds, but it's going to be a very messy field and a very inefficient one. But if you yoke the ox properly, then it cultivates straight rows. Everything comes out just the way it's supposed to. But without the yoke, there's no control, there's no mastery, and the ox doesn't learn its proper way. So we place the ol mitzvah, the yoke of the commandments, on a young boy, so he'll walk a straight path and do mitzvahs and do things right. So when it comes to the sexual urge, there had to be some boundaries, some mitzvot placed on it too. And then a young boy and a young woman, according to the rabbis, could make their life properly and honor the blessing that God created them to enjoy. So with that in mind, think first of all as the urge for intimacy, romance, and sex as a blessing, because it's created in us by God. What a beautiful thought. We're already transforming the expectation that this whole subject is taboo. It's not taboo. So I want to share with you, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share with you a number of texts. They come from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah specifically. Then we're going to go into rabbinic literature, from the 3rd century when the Mishnah was written, from the 6th century when the Talmud was completed. We'll go to the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century. And then even there's a Rabbi Jacob Emden who wrote in the 13th century. Now, in the course of Jewish history, this is almost contemporary stuff. So we might say, oh, the 13th century, it's so old. The Shulchan Aruch, it's such a long time ago. Not in the course of Jewish history. That's pretty contemporary. It's only when you get to a book like by Shmuley Boteach, Kosher Sex, where you get something kind of modern, maybe even a little crass. But there's beauty to this. There is really brilliance to this Jewish ethic, which I wish all of our children at age 13 learned, and certainly I wish many other people knew about. I don't think we would have these political and social struggles on this subject if Judaism had more to say about it in the public space. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll take this piece by piece, and I welcome your comments and reactions too. Okay, so now you can see my screen. So a Jewish sexual ethic source text with me. So first of all, I want to start with the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings. I mentioned this last week because the 7 blessings are what we round out the wedding service with. After you've exchanged the rings and exchanged the vows, the 7 blessings speak of God's glory and the ongoing process of creation reflected in that marriage. In effect, it means now that you're married, you can not only glorify God, but the ongoing process of creation is now in your hands. You're going to have a family now because you're married. So the 7th of the 7 blessings says, praised are you, God, who causes bride and groom to rejoice together. And together is a euphemism. And I tell young couples that I do premarital counseling with now that in the wedding, under the chuppah, when I say bride and groom to rejoice together, you'll be the only ones who understand that what I mean by that is now you can have a family. Everybody else is just waiting for the glass to break, but they should know that now they can begin to have a family. Now, with that in mind, the joy, the expectation, the rejoicing is all there in potential energy. But let's look at these definitions. This is really interesting. First of all, the word ona. Ona has many meanings. It can mean season, so it's springtime, that's an ona. It can also mean marital relations, the season of marital relations. It might be a woman's time of the month. It could be feelings of marital togetherness. So ona can take on all kinds of meanings that suggest the time, the feeling, the experience that you're entering. And ona can simply mean conjugal relations, okay? All right, mitzvah. You know mitzvah to mean a deed, a commandment, a good deed, but mitzvah is also a Talmudic euphemism for conjugal relations. The rabbis were rather polite in their language. They didn't want to say sex. They didn't want to say intercourse. So they said mitzvah, do the mitzvah. So if you were doing the mitzvah, you weren't just ladling soup. You were also having relations with your partner. So that's a nice Talmudic euphemism. And the next word is Shekhinah. Beautiful word. Shekhinah means the divine presence. It's a mystical word that comes from the Zohar, and we'll come to understand what that word means in just a moment. So laying the groundwork for this sexual ethic, we find, first of all, these are not words or principles that we're just pulling out of the air. These are foundational in Jewish understanding that goes all the way back to the Torah. So let's continue. We're going to come back to that one later from the Zohar. Let's go into the Bible, in the Torah itself. In the book of Exodus, early on, chapter 21, it says, "He shall not neglect her need for food, clothing, and ona." Now let's read it in an egalitarian way also for the sake of our contemporary times. She shall not neglect his need for food, clothing, and ona. Now, 3 is a good number. Things can really rest on a 3-legged stool. If you have 2, it topples over and you don't need much more than 3. So a good home, a good Jewish home that can sustain that marriage means you got to have food. And open the cabinet or the refrigerator and have food. Now, in biblical times, they didn't have refrigerators, but finding the food and sustenance to nourish that relationship might have been a challenge. It's not our problem today, thank God. Clothing. You should have respectable clothing to leave your house. And a married couple should have enough resources to clothe and dress one another. Again, today we have more than we need. Ona. So the book of Exodus says that they shall not neglect each other's need for ona. We already said for marital relations. That means that a marriage that has no intimacy, romance, sex, or any kind of physical affection is not a marriage. Sometimes it's the very reason that a marriage needs work and help and support. But as we grow older or our relationship changes, it doesn't mean that it has to be the same thing all the time. It just means that ona suggests that there is a rhythm to our time together that might mean certain forms of intimacy, holding hands, a hug, time shared. And we can talk about that in a few minutes. The next text from Torah comes from Deuteronomy at the very end. And it says, when a man takes a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt 1 year for the sake of his household to give happiness to the woman he has married. Now let's read that the other way too. They should really care for each other enough that in the first year of marriage, neither one of them should be away from each other for too long. Now, going out to the army today is not quite the same as it was in biblical times or even in Israel today. But the point here is that in the first year of marriage, that's the time to cement, to deepen, to concretize routine and intimacy and all the things that will ultimately grow and flourish as that relationship continues. Sometimes I also say to young couples, you only get 1 year to be newlyweds. And you don't get to pick which year that is. It can't be newlyweds in the third year or the fifth year. Everybody knows your first year's newlyweds is extraordinarily special. They give you time and room and space to do what you need to and to celebrate the way that you want. So you can't postpone that newlywed year, nor can you be away from each other if you expect the relationship to deepen the way that it should in the first year. So the first year is very important. And with young couples, I do talk about their work. Will they be traveling? Will they be away from each other for 3 months or 6 months at a time? These are really important subjects to talk about with young couples. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that we can come back. And are there any questions or reactions to this? I might have even flustered some of you with some of Judaism's expectations on this subject. Anything?
Rabbi, I got a question for you. I appreciate you turning the sexes around and trying to make it egalitarian, but from at some point along the way, I wonder if there's an argument to be made that there's a reason why it's not egalitarian written that way, and it's just to make sure that there is equality, and it's to make sure that the man is obliged and has a stronger obligation, perhaps, to make sure there's happiness in the marriage and his wife is satisfied, that kind of thing.
Yes, I think, Scott, it's a good question. Let me go back to the gallery view so I can see everybody. The rabbis were themselves speaking from a very male-centered point of view and perspective. There's no question. They, unfortunately, in those ancient times or even in medieval times, did not regard the sexes as equal. They really did regard a man as being stronger, the one who was going to have to be tamed, so to speak, and the woman was gentle and sensitive. So when I use the term egalitarian, I'm really doing it for our purpose and our sake. They also remembered uh, themselves as young teenagers. These were scholars and rabbis who were writing the rules for those who were younger than they were. So there's no question they were writing in a time that is a little difficult for us to understand when we're trying to be as egalitarian as we're aiming to be. I thought you were going to ask, but I'll use this opportunity to add that in Reform Judaism, where we really do regard same-sex relationships and others to be special and sacred too, we really apply these sexual ethics to those couples as well, to say that monogamy, sacred holiness between two lovers is also important. So I have a version of these texts that I also share with same-sex couples to be sure that the ideal in a relationship is love that is special and sacred between them and not to be shared and not to be violated once that sacred relationship is created. Good. Other questions? Reactions? You know, I'm often, whether I'm with younger couples or older couples, the idea that our sexual urge is a gift from God and blessed and therefore not ugly and not to be corrupted or exploited by us, I think sets it in a whole new frame. Did you have that reaction too? You can nod your head and not implicate yourself. Okay, very good. All right, so let's go on. I think there's so much to learn from the brilliance of our Jewish text. I'm going to share my screen and we'll continue with rabbinic literature. So outside the Bible, we now come to Mishnah Talmud, Mishnah Torah, which is Maimonides from the 12th century, Shulchan Aruch as well. So Yevamot 62a is from Talmud, and here it says, he who neglects his marital duties to his wife is a sinner, or she who neglects her marital duties to her husband is a sinner. Now, I want to stop sharing for a moment because I want to ask you a question. It's not a quiz question. But why would they say that to neglect marital duties to the other would render one a sinner? what does it have to do with what I already taught?
I'll just address that.
Yeah, please.
I think if you don't consider the needs of your partner, of your wife or partner, whatever, husband, that it's a measure of disrespect as far as I'm concerned. In other words, you don't think enough of them to meet their needs. Now, among their needs is, as you mentioned, food, shelter, but it's also sex.
Yeah.
And to just say, well, I'm not going to do that, I don't want a part of that, actively disrespects them.
Okay. Thank you.
The
I think that's an important part of the answer. And there's one more piece that could come even before what you said, Bobby, because the idea of sinning, against whom are we sinning? Not only our partner,
God.
But God, yeah.
that's
Yeah,
right.
I mean, if this is something that God has given to us that we're supposed to do, no, Bobby, then yeah, you're not only disrespecting your partner, you're disrespecting God.
Right. So in Judaism, anything that God gives us for joy, if we don't partake, if we don't enjoy it, we're transgressing. So that might be why your mother might have said, a little cake, a bissel cake, something, eat, enjoy, because joy was something to grab when you had it. And if you denied yourself or others of it, it was to deny something that came into your life. So even the relationship, love, affection, romance, all of that, to deny yourself, and then on top of it, somebody else in your life, is to transgress, to misunderstand the gift of that blessing. Okay? All right, now we can go on, because I think that's a really fundamental idea of keeping God in the framework of the relationship, and that'll come back later. The next one comes from Eruvin. It says, he may not force himself upon her. He may not even approach her in a way to cause her to fear him. Now, read that in the larger sense, egalitarian way. I don't have to read it for you. You can understand it yourself. What is fundamental then in our Jewish understanding of the gift of relationship and marriage? There's no room for domestic abuse. It is a violation. It is a sin. So long before the issue was addressed in public, or we had other resources to react to it, Talmud made it very clear that the marriage relationship was, first of all, we call it by two words in Hebrew. One is nisuin, just to describe the nature of the relationship. We also call it kiddushin. And kiddushin has at its root the word kadosh. Kadosh means holy, like kiddush or kaddish. So kiddushin is a sacred relationship where a sacred boundary is placed around it, and the couple within it is set apart for a special purpose. Therefore, to abuse one another, to approach one in fear, is to totally misunderstand, disregard, and disrespect the very nature of that relationship which God has blessed. Couldn't be clearer than that. So there's no room for any of that. And you'll see we're going to go on. There are other references to that subject too. Now, Talmud, as I say, the Babylonian Talmud was completed in the 6th century. So now we come to Shulchan Aruch, which is different than the Talmud. Quickly, I can say the Talmud is like case law. Shulchan Aruch is a code, a very terse, very specific code law. And it says there, each man according to his strength and occupation. So let me explain what this means. Each man according to his strength and occupation, there's really sort of, you can think of it as in a table. The rabbis figured that a person of different strengths had different appetites for romance and sex. So if you were a big guy, a big, strong, I don't know, a lumberjack, a starker, somebody with really a lot of strength, and you had a bigger appetite and you were entitled to more. And so they said, according to your strength and occupation. So it just, you came home and you needed more. If you were a tailor or something a little less vigorous, then maybe you didn't need so much. So the rabbis who sat in judgment over their communities really determined by their calculation how a couple should thrive, how they should nourish each other sexually. Some had a greater appetite, some didn't, and they allowed them to conduct themselves in certain ways. Now, we don't live under rabbinic supervision, thank God, in that manner. So how do we understand this text today? First of all, according to one's strength, a lot of couples are physically compatible. Some are not. But whatever this case may be, how we hold, how we embrace, how we handle each other is a matter of how we understand our own strength and our partners. Can't hold too tight. You can't go in for the kill. You have to be thoughtful, patient, sensitive. Occupation. We're not blacksmiths, we're not lumberjacks anymore. A few of us are car repairmen anymore. We really are professionals and we have soft hands and clean lives. So it isn't really that big a deal. But I've said to young couples before, if you're coming in from a run or the gym and you come and say, honey, I'm home, meet me in the bedroom. Well, you have every right to say, you stink. Go take a shower and meet me in the bedroom. Don't just come in and have this expectation that because I'm here for you, I should give for you. So we have to be mindful, extraordinarily mindful of our strength, our occupation, even our recreation. Now, I know even couples get a little red-faced when we have this conversation together, and it's fun to giggle about, but it's so true. It's so true. When we enter a relationship, very often in marriage, sometimes the rules, which is counterintuitive, go out the window. When we get married, we think we can say anything we want. We can treat our partner any way we want. We can approach our partner any way we want. And it's completely the opposite, all the more so. When we're married, that person, our wife, our husband, our partner is on a pedestal. We treat that person with respect and care and affection and sensitivity. We would never approach our partner with anything but utter love and admiration. So the rabbis are not only approaching this from a sense of understanding God's will for us, but how that relationship reflects our honor of God's way in our life. And the fact that Shulchan Aruch, which is a law code, is so specific suggests how detailed the rabbis are actually approaching this subject. It isn't just theoretical or idealistic. They're actually charting it out, what each person is entitled to. All right, let me go back to share so we can get a little bit more in. Now, Maimonides from the 12th century says, she is in no way like a captive who is compelled to be intimate with the one she hates. Again, vice versa, we can also say about a man and in any partner relationship. The reason Maimonides makes this clear in the Mishnah Torah, it's his own interpretation of this subject, is that marriage is not a captive situation. We don't get married to hold a partner hostage. And love, being intimate with somebody is not a requisite part of the relationship if there's no love and affection between them. In fact, it's also a reason why divorce is a possibility in Judaism. Now, I say to couples, and I'll share with you, divorce is not something that we advocate, we don't promote, but it's not a sin in Judaism. If there are grounds for divorce, including domestic abuse or just simply hating and despising your partner, then divorce is possible. You can go to the Beit Din, you can go to the rabbinic court. You can go, today, of course, we rely on the civil courts. And divorce allows you then to find a person that you're compatible with, you love, and you can honor these teachings with. So just because you're married, Maimonides makes clear that you are not compelled to do anything against your will, especially if you truly despise the other person. And by the way, criticism in a relationship can be healthy. It can be constructive. Somebody once said, though, if criticism turns into contempt, then there's a problem. Contempt leads to marital therapy and sometimes ultimately to divorce. All right, let's go on. Jacob Emden, writing in the 17th century, says a man may not cohabit with his wife unless there is love and peace between them. Now, at the heart of it, it says, it's when there's intimacy, it's love and peace. That's what intimacy is. When they cohabit, it's all about love and peace. But a couple should not say, we're fighting, we don't like each other, there's contempt, let's have a baby. It'll bring us closer together. Now, I will tell you, you won't believe it, but it's true. A couple once said to me in my office, we're not getting along, we're on the brink of separating. We thought we'd have a baby, it'll bring us closer together. I can't begin to tell you, it was a teachable moment for them. And thankfully our tradition was wise enough to address the subject early on for me to teach them that that was not what they were supposed to do, because they shouldn't cohabit with each other unless there is love and peace between them. And you don't do it for the wrong reason in order to have the right outcome. And so thankfully they listened. All right, let's go on. Rabbi Emden also says this: conjugal relations provide relief from psychological tension, dissipates melancholy, soothes nervousness and temper, and gladdens the soul. Now, this is Rabbi Emden in the 17th century. You know, they say the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're all human beings. We all know these things to be true. They didn't know anything about brain chemistry, but we do. And having sexual relations can leave somebody feeling happy and glad. Some people fall asleep, some people have a cigarette. Whatever it might be, it's a feeling that is unique and creates the brain chemistry to make somebody feel less melancholy. It can soothe nervousness and temper and make you feel very happy. Now, I think that Jacob Emden was writing brilliantly here too. So you know that on Shabbat, we're taught that having sexual relations on Shabbat is a double mitzvah. How many of you have heard that? I hope so. A double mitzvah. So here's how it works. You don't have to do it twice. You get double points. Okay? It's double point day, right? Here's why. Okay? First of all, it's Shabbat. It's a day of gladness. So you're celebrating Shabbat and enjoying it. And if you have sexual relations on Shabbat, it's joyful. It brings gladness to you. So you're doubling the joy. It's a beautiful time for that experience. And you know, the old saying, some of you do, young couples do not know this saying, but you do. Remember the old saying, not tonight, honey, I have a headache? Well, Judaism just solved that and said, actually, conjugal relations relieves, dissipates melancholy, soothes nervousness and temper, and gladdens the soul. So your headache is resolved. You'll save money on Tylenol. So this is great stuff. I mean, all right, so a little bit more. Okay, so now let's get to Shabbat chapter 30 and the Zohar from Jewish mysticism. Here it says, the Shekhinah, remember the divine presence, joins with husband and wife when they unite in love. Now, what does this mean? The Shekhinah joins with husband and wife when they unite in love. All right, so what it means is, remember, going back, the rabbis are thinking about this. They're thinking about that intimate moment between them and their wives. And in that very special moment, when they have that moment of climax, is an extraordinary, unique feeling that they experience nowhere else at no other time except with each other. And that powerful moment that gladdens their soul and dissipates melancholy and is a gift and a mitzvah that they do perhaps even on Shabbat. To whom would they give credit for such a feeling? They would not give themselves credit to say, oh, I'm such a lover I am that I created this magnificent feeling between me and my wife. And she wouldn't say, such a lover I am that I created this magnificent feeling between me and my husband. They were pious enough to say, this magnificent feeling came from God. This is God's gift to us, between us, such love, such depth of feeling between us. It must be the Shekhinah. It must be the divine presence who unites with husband and wife when they unite in love. And what did they say? The result of such love, such divine presence, beautiful and brilliant children. Now, what's the proof, the evidence? Each of you. You are your parents' beautiful and brilliant children, you see? So the rabbis were right. And our tradition, throughout the entire process of meeting and relating and getting married and relationship and having children, the whole thread in all of it is responding to God's gift and the blessing that love and intimacy can be. Now, there's one more text and then a few other notes that I'll share with you, and we'll have some opportunity for discussion and question. The last one is interesting. So this one says, from the 13th century, when you join with her, arrange it so that you allow her to attain satisfaction first. Okay? I'm not making it up. I didn't bring it to embarrass anybody, but here it is. When you join with her, arrange it so that you allow her to attain satisfaction first. So this is the gareth kodesh from the 13th century. So in this particular statement, the rabbis recognize, again, they're talking to and placing this yoke of the commandments on the necks of young boys who are getting married. A young teenager can be aroused by the wind, right? And he can be satisfied with nothing. A woman, he finds, takes a little more time, a little more sensitive, a little more complex, so to speak. But if he's going to be a good lover, a good husband, and understand his duty as God has commanded him to do, then he'll make sure that his wife has satisfaction first. Because his satisfaction, which is not unimportant, is just so much easier to accomplish. So it's a beautiful way to round out these texts and to understand that in the company of another, a man, a woman, however the lovers can be defined today, there's an ideal that is bound by holiness, and that holiness is also gifted by God. So what we have in our heart and our soul to share with somebody is a gift, it's a blessing, and we should treat it as such. Now, what's true in relationships today, as you're married longer and your relationships longer, that things do change. Many of these rules were written for teenagers. I don't see any teenagers on the screen. We didn't have an age limit, but as the body changes, as physiology changes, the one thing that doesn't change is love, intimacy, holding each other, sharing time with each other. That is also a reflection of what all of these things really speak to as blessings that God gives us to share. When I speak to young couples, the one thing that they still have trouble understanding is that they always thought that romance and sex and relations were spontaneous. I said, oh no, it's not. Can be. But sometimes when you're busy, you have to schedule in your calendar for romantic weekend. You have to call your parents or the babysitter to be sure that you can schedule time to get away and be close to each other. And they're kind of horrified at the thought that what they thought was spontaneous and sort of in their own power was now being controlled by so many outside forces. So in effect, we do have to plan. We have to be intentional. We can't just wait for the feeling to come. We have to be aware of our partner's needs, and we have to approach with sensitivity and thoughtfulness to reach out a hand, to embrace, to give a kiss. If it leads to intercourse or sexual relations, well, mazel tov. But it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. And even the moment that you plan on the calendar, I'll make dinner and you bring the wine, can still be that moment that is shared with nobody else but your partner. And so you can define it any way you wish. The one thing that I urge young couples to do, and I think it's true for us, is we get misled by images of what is successful lovemaking, intimacy, and romance. Hollywood has misled us. Many other examples have misled us. The truth is that if you're following Jewish guidelines, or at least the principles of them, within your own home and your own private world, that is the definition of your love and romance and intimacy. You don't need anybody else to validate it for you as long as you're validating each other. I do share with young couples too, and it's important at their age and time in life, but it's important to say broadly that the need for such intimacy, which really follows us through our lifetime, is something that we should only seek within the bounds of that relationship and that marriage. And if, God forbid, you have to scratch that itch by going somewhere else, then it's really time for what is the most sustainable feature of a relationship. And it isn't always love, it's communication. Communication is the biggest, most important word. I say to young couples, and I'll say to you, that in bed or wherever it is, again, the phrase, the 7-year itch. After 7 years of doing the same thing the same way, you're a little tired, it's a little monotonous. So what do you need? A little communication. I like this, I like that, I don't like this, don't do this. If you talk to each other, the worst that would happen is you giggle with each other. You turn a little red face with each other. But who else would you want to giggle with or turn a little embarrassed with but your partner? It creates intimacy, privacy, secrecy. And in those moments, things get better and maybe even more interesting. So that lovers who are in their 20s can still be lovers when they're in their 80s. And all the years in between could be something interesting, something that develops, and ultimately is not disappointing at all. But I think we've been taught and trained and molded to be embarrassed about our intimate feelings, and our failure to communicate has sometimes left us either alone or simply unsatisfied. And Judaism says, look, God knows it too. So if we can talk about it before God, and God is aware of what God has given us, then we don't have to be embarrassed between each other. So let me pause there. Granted, I've laid out a lot of material and text, and I'm glad that I could speak not just I wasn't speaking from the top of my head. I'm speaking authentically and sincerely from our Jewish texts, which outline for us something that is so critical to the well-being of our home. Remember, it's all balanced on food and clothing and intimate relations. Go figure. So questions, comments, thoughts, disagreements, or perhaps even what struck you about this that perhaps you never knew or didn't expect to hear from your own Judaism? Yeah, Miriam?
I think it's interesting that the interpretations that follow Genesis are very encouraging toward intimacy. And yet what we learn, or maybe it's just, I don't know if it's actually Jewish interpretation of Adam and Eve, but intimacy that was spontaneous between two people was punished.
Mm-hmm.
In no uncertain terms. And is that just a teaching, or did the rabbis go back and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not going to work out too well?
So I think what's helpful in Judaism is that the rabbi said, it isn't a matter that anything goes. Mm-hmm. So the experience of the Garden of Eden helped us to understand that there is modesty. There are boundaries. Now, what are they? The boundary isn't don't ever look at it or don't ever touch it. The boundary is now, how do we make it holy again? If we've transformed it from something that was a sin in the Garden of Eden, how do we restore it to something that is holy? And that's now the human endeavor, not only to aim to return to the Garden of Eden, which is a whole subject matter in and of itself. But how do we take this particular subject and make it holy and good again? And I think that's what the rabbis were aiming for us to accomplish. Yeah, Bobby.
Yeah, when we first meet Abraham in the Torah, he's not a monogamous man. He's not in a monogamous relationship. He has a wife. He has handmaidens. I don't know how many, but he has others. And somewhere along the line, monogamy was incorporated into Jewish and non-Jewish. Okay, I mean, you can't only have one wife, one husband at this point in time. When did it change in the Torah or the Bible? When did it change? When did the rabbis start teaching that monogamy was important or it should be maintained?
The truth is, if you really look at historical evidence, the polygamy in Judaism, not for the sake of having, not in the sort of the Mormon sense, but in the concubines and others, it really was quite late. Really, 800s, 900s. It was much, much later. But the idea of having a unique relationship with one was already Talmudic and emerging. It's difficult to say that it happened overnight or that it happened in one particular way, but the idea of having these intimate relationships that were more sacred and holy was emerging until culturally it became more defined in one relationship. And our own experience in the Western world is really is sort of the capstone on the whole subject, because it's illegal to have more than one wife, even though Judaism in the Middle East and Arab cultures too, for a very, very long time, permitted. I think I did see another hand. Bonnie, was it you had a question?
It's not so much a question as an observation. That it just seems to me that it takes a sense of maturity to understand all of this that you have explained to us and given to us. And unfortunately, that maturity doesn't come from the get-go. I mean, as most things don't. So first of all, I mean, I think that your counseling with kids, I would call them, about to get married is incredible. But I just, it just seems like you're almost set up for failure before you're mature enough to really understand all of this.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Bonnie. I'll tell you, all the young couples that I've counseled over the years before their weddings, they giggle and they turn red a little bit because they can't believe they're having this conversation with their rabbi.
Yeah.
Right. But they're so grateful because many of them, whether it's two Jews or an interfaith couple, they bring to the conversation anxieties and fears, insecurities that they don't know what to do with. And they feel that when they enter the bedroom, they have to perform in ways that, what's going to happen? Will they be judged, evaluated? When we talk about it in mature ways and in sacred ways, then they realize that they both have a responsibility to handle this in a grown-up way. And I think adding the sacred quality to it helps them all both know that there's something more that each of them can do about it. And no one is perfect at it, and it takes years to understand. Now, I would say that learning about this now, rather than say 50 years ago, should not be a disappointment to anybody here. I think it should be maybe, an epiphany, maybe a release to say, oh my gosh, maybe I have been holding back, or maybe the insecurity I've been feeling is something that my Judaism is actually telling me to embrace, to talk about, to share. And so even touching a hand or an arm or a hug can actually be a deep expression of something that not only do I deserve, but I need to give. So, it takes two to tango. But our Judaism says you got to dance, you got to get on the floor, and you got to enter the scene. So it's never too late. And the beautiful thing that I see, and I'm actually doing a wedding in June for an older couple. Both lost their partners, and they're getting remarried. Why? Because they've never been alone. And they really want to have somebody in their life. They're not going to have children. They're not having relations for the sake of a family and procreative purposes, but intimacy, romance, companionship, friendship, that desire really never ends.
No, it does not.
Right. Good. Other comments?
Rabbi?
Yes, please, Ed.
Yeah, you keep talking about counseling young people, and I think you just sort of alluded to it. I think this is a message for all of us every year that we need to sort of reignite our intimacy with our significant other. So it's not just a message for young people. I think it probably is even more important as our relationship changes as we get older. So I hope you take that message to us old folks.
Well, I did. Tonight and last week I did, and I'm so glad that you came. I don't consider you old folk at all, Ed, but I will tell you that I taught this material over 4 weeks many years ago, and when the course ended, a couple came up to me, older couple, holding hands, and they said to me, "Rabbi, I wish we knew this when we were younger." And what they meant by it was things worked differently when they were younger. Things happened a little more spontaneously when they were younger. But through the course, they learned that intimacy doesn't have to end. So it may be something that we need to talk about more, especially as not only are we living longer, but our desire is always there. We should help people understand that desire is healthy and sacred. In the chat, there was a comment that many couples are living together first. I will tell you, they're all living together first. And when I sit down and I get some data from them and I ask, what's your address? Are you living together? They still are nervous in front of the rabbi telling me that they're living together. And I say, it's not a test question. I know you're living together. There's only 1 out of 1 million that isn't living together. So even talking about this sexual intimacy, it's not that they aren't practicing already, but I tell them practice makes perfect. So, then we just sort of give them the manual, the instructions to be sure that it isn't just a response to urges, but how do they maintain and manage that urge that gives it meaning. Other comments? I'm gonna.
Here.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think the rabbis are very brilliant for giving a roadmap to sort of, for the procreation of the race, you need younger members. And I think it was a brilliant way to say it's okay, it's fine, it's important that you know how to treat your mate and you continue having a good time and keeping the religion.
Right. I agree with you. I think their brilliance is so unique. Frankly, if we had this kind of sex education in school today, I don't think we'd have half the problems we do with pregnant teens and abortion rights and all the other issues. Because once we demystify such a beautiful subject, it becomes something beautiful that people want to cherish and share with somebody in a beautiful way. And if we stop telling people that God wants them not to touch it and look at it and feel it, then we can do with it what we should, which is something beautiful and very meaningful. There was another question in the chat about same-sex marriages. It's legal in this country. I have officiated at same-sex marriages. And in the counseling session, I share these texts. I've rewritten them so that 2 men or 2 women can feel respected through the language. The rabbis certainly were not talking to same-sex couples, but what I urge those couples to do is what I'm urging you to do, which is to be monogamous, to treat the relationship as sacred, and to be lovely and meaningful and intimate with each other in ways that are helpful. So there's nothing tonight that I said to you that I wouldn't say to same-sex couples. And in truth, they appreciate it too. I don't know what their lives are, just as, and I don't know what other people's lives are, but how they regard each other might maybe change or demystify what expectations are of same-sex couples. I don't know what people have sort of ulterior ideas of what same-sex couples go through, as we would say, in their bars or their social settings. And that's not fair for us to do. Finding each other is hard enough, but once we can put a sacred framework around the relationship, I think we lift up that relationship to what it ought to be. God created them. I always try to say, God created each of us in God's image. Who did we become? Such judges of all that God created. I don't know. I'm not above God to judge. I may be dumbfounded by what God created, but it's not my job to judge it and to malign it or to destroy it. My job is to figure it out and try to find a way to respect it. We're just at about 8 o'clock, and David told me not to keep you more than an hour or our screens go dark.
You don't give the rabbi the microphone for too long.
Yeah, that's right. Rabbis and microphones are a really dangerous combination. But I think if I want to leave you with anything, it's simply, first of all, to say thank you. I think that any question that we have as Jews or seeking Jews, there's always a place within Jewish boundaries to find an answer. We really never have to go outside the boundary to find an answer that can be modern and relevant and joyful, as we say at Beth Israel. Of course, we have science and all kinds of other fields and concentrations of understanding to learn from. But I don't think we have to step, at least from a religious point of view, we don't have to step outside our Judaism to find what is so essential, what is so timely and timeless for us to understand and help us appreciate the lives that we're living. So as I say to young couples, practice makes perfect. I usually give this sheet of text as homework to the couples. I say, take it, put it in your sock drawer, you'll take it out later. And if you have children that are young, don't let them get in the way of the lovemaking that you deserve to share with each other. So take this time for yourselves. And I hope that this lesson amplifies and lifts up the beautiful friendships and relationships that you share with each other, and God willing, if you're alone, with somebody in the future. And be in touch. If you'd like a copy of the text, I'm happy to give it to David, and David can distribute it to you as well. Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. As an additional reminder, on Thursday at noon is our next session on monthly Midrash, so please join us for that with Rabbi Sadaloff. Also, Rabbi Lyon is going to be teaching Torah study on Shabbat morning as well, on Saturday morning. And on Sunday is our kickoff of the mitzvah week. So that'll be an opportunity. There's a blood drive on Sunday as well in the morning from 9:30 to 12:30. And also on Tuesday is our big Wolf Tumim Distinguished Lecture Series featuring Ann Applebaum and Ambassador, who will be leading our session. So please join us for that, as we are really excited about those programs and everything else coming up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody.